Thanks very much, Anne, and as well as to Aaron and Chee for all your comments. So I'm going to try and respond, provide a short response to some of the comments and also some of the questions, and then I'd like to open the discussion up to the rest of the people in this room. So I'll start with Aaron. You make really, thank you for your points. They're all really very pertinent, and I agree with you. Games are the most interesting instrument that I know of out there in terms of pre-bunking tools, because as you say, they are very immersive experience, and our participants, almost all of them said that they really enjoyed playing the game and they found it interesting. And so I think this is really, gaming is really the way to go to not only develop more public interest in the topic of fake news, but also awareness about the pitfalls of fake news and the strategies that fake news producers use. You also mentioned that these pre-bunking interventions really need to start at the classroom, and I totally agree with you. And but the interesting thing is, so the original version of this experiment was done in a classroom, and they had like really good results. Like the game showed to be very effective in increasing the students' ability to identify fake news after the intervention. But that's why we wanted to do our experiment on the non-school going population, because when you're already an adult, a lot of your news consumption, information consumption is filtered through pre-existing beliefs, through your preconceptions about a particular topic. And so the views of millennials and Gen X and boomers are typically already a little bit more solidified, a bit more rooted by the time you're at this age. And so we wanted to see whether the game would also be as effective on a population that is that has already developed quite strong views about particular issues. So I think you're right, it's really important that we start these interventions already in the classroom. But I think the greater challenge is in the older population that have already have certain pre-existing views and beliefs about the contentious issues. The point about long-range topics and short-range topics, you're absolutely right. I think the fact that we made the game about COVID-19 vaccines could have really distorted a lot of the statistical results, because it's, as you said, it's so in our face. There's so much priming already going on in our natural environment that it could really have affected the results. And when we rolled out the game, it was between April. We started the gaming sessions in April, and we wrapped it up, I think, at the end of June. And that was around the time when the Delta variant was starting to take hold. And so we also started to see, so we saw, in the coding results, I would talk about it on Friday's session, but we saw that a lot of the concerns around the vaccines had to do with the variants. And so our data was very much situated within that particular juncture of COVID-19 unfolding in Singapore at that time. And it would be interesting to see whether the effects of this game would be different on other topics, such as climate change, for example, in Singapore. I share with you your concern about impersonation being the most effective in deceiving participants. And And this is especially concerning given, as you also pointed out, most of our participants are highly educated, and you know, what I guess Carol would consider information savvy individuals, and yet they still fell for impersonation. And actually, there was another lecture that I gave where I put two pieces of fake news, and I asked. It was a room full of academics as well, and I asked them to indicate which one they thought was fake news, and actually both of them were fake news. But I created one. I just made it myself by like cutting and pasting, and they still fell for the impersonation piece of fake news as well. So I think you are absolutely right. And when it comes to what do we do about this, I think we really, you know, I guess what is helpful is to start to highlight, you know, just some key red flags, and communicate that to the public, to get them as a start to ask questions like, oh, why is this logo in a slightly different place? You know, why is the audio lagging a little bit from the image, or something like that. I mean, I'm not a technical expert, but maybe this is where we need to get technical experts on deepfakes to come in and tell us what are some of the key red flags that would indicate that this is a deepfake, and then really make a public campaign around these key red flags to get the public to be more aware about these techniques, deception techniques. The point about trust in government and too much trust, you're right. And in fact, I didn't put up some of these other quotes, but it was in the report. We had some participants, especially the millennials, who say, oh yeah, you know, we trust mainstream media because there's government censorship, and so they need to be careful of what they say. And so, I mean, it's a bit funny that was the outcome, leading to higher trust in mainstream media, especially in the context of COVID-19. But the other thing that we also saw is that our participants really compare mainstream media with the US especially, and they compare, you know, like Fox News and CNN, and they say, like, you know, look at what the way media is done overseas. They are aware that the way media is reporting in other countries is also in a way, you know, that they already have a pre-existing political position on a particular issue, and they will report it as such. So they compare that with the way ST and CNA reports news, and they see a big difference, and therefore express a higher level of trust, in the sense that they know that mainstream media in Singapore doesn't take a particular political stance on the issues that they're reporting. So I think for that kind of relates a little bit to Chee Kong's point about trust in mainstream media, about trust in alternative media and trust in science, and how do we manage those effects. That's interesting that you raised that, because as you mentioned, that was only well, I mentioned it in the report as just a minor finding. And I think there is potential for us to explore a little bit more about the role of alternative media in Singapore, and how that affects whether it's trust in mainstream media or trust in government and attitudes towards science. What we found in the focus group discussions was that a number of participants said that if I want like factual information, I go to ST and CNA. But if I want to form my own opinion about the topic, I go to Mothership and Online Citizen. So this is what they were saying. So I think this is also something that we need to keep in mind. you are right, there is a great potential for alternative media to have a greater effect on public perceptions and public opinions about some key public issues. Okay, so the other point I wanted to address by Chee was the point you made about millennials being more comfortable navigating in the gray zone. And you're right. And I think what was really powerful in this experiment was, and we didn't emphasize this enough, and I think this is something that I really need to do in the future iterations of this experiment, was that they were quite surprised at how badly they did, like, or they were quite surprised that they didn't score better in the fake news test, especially post-game. And some of them, when we got to the focus group discussion, they were also like, really, they were really battered by it. And they, when we talked to them about, what do you think about the experiment, the game? And then they just wanted to talk about the score, and they were like complaining that, the test was so difficult. And so I think this could address both your point, Chee Kong, and Aaron's point about level of confidence and complacency, that I think as part of playing the game and getting them to do the test, it really reveals to them that, hey, actually you're not that good at identifying fake news, and this could really be a learning point as part of the experiment that makes them a bit more aware. And I think what we really need to do in future iterations of this experiment is to really break down the score. Like, okay, you scored 8 out of 10 in the pregame test, and these were the questions that you got correct and wrong, and these were the deception strategies that you failed to identify. And then in the same for so just to go a little bit more into the details of the test, of their test outcomes. I think that could be also a deeper learning point that we could emphasize a bit more in future iterations of this experiment. To Anne's comments, thank you so much. I think your study is so interesting that you identified the 2 main topics. And as you say, this really resonated also with our findings on our participants' perceptions about COVID-19 vaccines and what their main concerns were. I don't want to go too much into this because I'll talk about it on Friday. But what we also saw was that you mentioned, okay, that was a lot of concern about the political and economic motives of institutions when it came to the development of the vaccines. We also saw the same here, but there was a bit differentiated in the sense that most of this doubt, most of this suspicion about the political motivations was directed at Western institutions, whereas when we asked in our questionnaire quite distinct questions, do you trust pharmaceutical companies in Singapore, and do you trust pharmaceutical companies in general? What we saw was that there was a high level of trust in institutions and companies that were based in Singapore, and then a much lower level of trust in similar institutions outside of Singapore. And you're right. It's really difficult. As you rightly point out, debunking tools. You're always playing catch up, and they don't go as wide and fast as fake news does. And so I think, as you rightly point out, we need to give people kind of the language to be able to, or give people the frameworks to be able to already preemptively identify or have suspicions, at least to first doubt when they're encountering fake news. And I think, as I kind of pointed out in the presentation and also the report, what our participants found most useful or the strongest learning point was having these characters, having these deception techniques highlighted to them. It gives them a framework to kind of like say, okay, this headline looks like a clickbait. That headline looks like a conspiracy theorist. And then, I mean, we don't need them to, in a way, like all be scientists, because not everyone can be scientists. But maybe what we need to emphasize in public education and media literacy and science literacy campaigns is just some of these key frameworks that enable people, the public, to immediately just have red flags. And so maybe just having a red flag is enough for them to reject the information at the get-go and not read further into that. And I think, yeah, games are a great tool for communicating those frameworks. Yeah, I think I will stop here in terms of my comments, but I'll give first the panelists a chance to respond with any other comments that you would like to raise.
I did have a couple, Catherine. Thanks so much. And thank you so much to Chee Kong and Anne as well. I found your comments fascinating. Just a couple of quick things to mention. Chee Kong, you talked about the importance of constant reminders, right? And I must confess, I'm a bit torn about these. I agree with you that some level of repetition is important. But there is a point of diminishing marginal returns on this, I think, although maybe that's just me thinking like an economist. But I think there might well be. And my worry is if we do too much, whether people then end up desensitized and inured to the falsehoods, rather, and they just think, oh, it's yet another of those nagging things, right? Rather than actually responding. And so I think we need to find that Goldilocks point. It's a hard one. Often in government, we try and be wary of what we call the Medusa effect, where if the government over intervenes, we turn things that are otherwise alive and vibrant into stone, like the Greek Gorgon Medusa. This is a concept that my friend Kwame Apaya, who's teaching at NYU now, likes to use when he talks about interventions on race and religion. But I think it could well apply here as well, and we want to avoid the Medusa effect on falsehoods. It's a difficult balance, and it's something we struggle with all the time. And the more I think we have evidence of what works versus what doesn't work, rather than just bureaucrats' hypotheses, the more informed our work can be, I think. Yeah, so that was just one quick thing. Then you also mentioned, Chee Kong, the importance of long-term consumption of falsehoods, right? I fully agree with you on that. I think there is a potential slow burn type of falsehood that may not merit immediate intervention, but over time there can be kind of as what you might describe as a normalization of a falsehood culture, and I would worry about that. I guess again there are parallels and analogies in the space of interethnic or identity politics, right? Where there can be microaggressions. Can you have micro falsehoods as well? And do many micro falsehoods add up to an overall culture of normalized falsehood? Again, I don't know what the facts and the data are, whether these things aggregate in that way. So if Catherine or someone else at CITIC are looking for another stream of study, I think that could be a really useful one that will help us to calibrate policy. And then just a very quick observation on something Anne pointed out, right, about debunks not spreading as far as the initial falsehoods. That has certainly been our experience, and this one we do track and have quite a bit of data on. We think we certainly don't see the debunks moving as fast, and that's partly why in our own Prevention Against Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, we don't actually ask for falsehoods to be taken down. We ask them to be kept with a correction notice next to it, so that the spread actually continues from the old falsehood, rather than you take it away and then people don't even realize that it was falsehood in the first place. I'll just say that this was the subject of a fair amount of criticism in the early days of that legislation. But since January 6th, when people realized that Twitter was doing exactly the same thing to the US president, we've had a lot less criticism on it. So I'd like to think that we were a bit ahead of our time on that. Thanks.
Okay, if I may jump in here. So actually, I wanted to mention something about the distrust of Western media and try to link it to a point that Aaron was talking about. I'm just thinking aloud and potentially wading into something different, controversial topic. But it's interesting how this distrust of Western media has crept in, and whether that is in fact a consequence of a drip feed. I won't call them falsehoods, but certain information, be it by Trump or be it from China speaking out against the Western media coverage, but that seems to be also a long-term consequence, because maybe 2 or 3 years back, there is a high level of regard for what we call Western media. So that is a real life impact playing out, I would say. So yeah, I agree with Aaron in terms of how do you calibrate so that the reminders don't come across as preaching or lecturing. I suppose we will need to be more organic, and that there are instances, when such opportunities arise. I think an organic approach would be much better than say a campaign to remind people constantly. Yeah, so that's what I think.
Actually, Chee Kong, I was just wondering on the point about reminders and stuff. I remember, in the past, at Straits Times, on the last page, there was always like a crossword puzzle or something, like some quiz, right? And then that you could do and get the answers on the back side. I was wondering whether, it would be something that is possible to have maybe like a fake news quiz instead, like the fake news quiz of the week, and then people can just every week just do some tests, as instead of kind of like a crossword puzzle, but related to fake news, and then they will learn the answers straight away from doing that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. In fact, when we still had our print paper, Sudoku was one of our most popular feature. People would actually queue up just to play Sudoku. So I suppose we need to design a game such that it's so subtle and nuanced that you don't feel like they are trying to preach about fake news, but design it in such a way, in a smart way, that actually people enjoy playing the game. Yeah.
I think, Catherine, I might just add, for both Aaron and Chee Kong, I think we really see this as a multi-stakeholder solution. So, it's not just the platforms, it's not just government, it's not just media, but I think everyone, as well as, people themselves and their media literacy. So I think I'm writing an article at the moment, a journal article, about getting ahead of the E-curve as well. So these pre-bunks, I would hope, don't sort of sound too sort of reminder, to people, but we can preempt, okay, we're going to have, or there's been a change in decision, or something's coming out, or something's coming up. So it's about working with governments and also with media on how best to get that messaging out. So we saw a lot when, we were seeing data coming in about AstraZeneca and the rare blood clots. We actually worked with media partners and we said, stop saying breaking news, another person with a blood clot. You've actually got to turn it around and recraft how you're writing about this, and don't just wait until this happens, but write other articles, that are informative, and working with the science and just these explainers, but in a really that unfortunately they also have to be in a bite-sized way as well, because we're all sort of preaching to the converted here and happy to read an 800-word report. But when people are scrolling through on social media, it's still got to be able to be attention grabbing for them as well. And I really think that with media and government communications working together and thinking about it that way, as well as the tools that the platforms can use too, I think that can be a lot more empowering, so that when people are sharing things in, WhatsApp and in closed groups, they can go, oh, hang on, no, there's been information that I've already seen that actually might conflict with what this misinformation is trying to tell me, and so on.
Yeah, you're right, and I think it's very important for media to work very closely with the scientific organizations as well as governments. And actually, one of the points I wanted to make as well was that, I think in Singapore, this was a point that we made in our first journal article that I wrote with Olivia about the paradox of trust and public perceptions of COVID-19 risk about COVID-19, and that the government in Singapore was has been quite effective in using a defensive pessimism in communicating defensive pessimism. So they prepare the public already before the bad news hits that we are in for trouble coming, and and so they're quite good at doing that preemptively to prepare so that the public doesn't panic when the pandemic actually arrives, and we did see that. The other thing that I noticed also that I think is quite powerful, and I think it's also the part of the problem, at least in the US, is that the messaging is consistent across all the different spokespersons from the different ministries here, so the public doesn't get confused. And you see this quite strongly in the qualitative data, because we saw that our participants were literally saying the words and phrases that our ministers were saying about COVID-19, about what does the exit from COVID look like, and endemic, endemic, there's no zero cases, so you see, you really see that consistent messaging and preemptive pessimism are two quite powerful communicating tools. Yeah. Okay, great. We have some time left, and I would like to open this discussion to the other people in this room.
I'd love to make a few comments if this is a good moment.
Yeah, sure, let me go for it.
So it was really, really fun to be involved in this study. I particularly enjoyed the game that I was involved in. And it's been really interesting to hear all these sort of ideas and feedback points. So thank you very much indeed for that. So I've had three sort of sets of thoughts that have been bubbling up as the discussion has been going on. And none of them is kind of directly a question about this study, but more kind of where do we go next, or what's the next interesting question to ask. And I'd also be interested not only to hear your thoughts on it, Catherine, but also the other panelists. One question for me is, are we looking at the right thing? When we're thinking about whether people believe misinformation or disinformation, is that the most important thing? Or is the most important thing whether they share it? And we didn't really explore that at all. We would, in this study, it was all about whether people understood and were able to be sufficiently skeptical about the information they received. And we didn't ask them, would you pass this on? And that speaks, I think that relates to a point that Anne made in passing about humor. And then in fact, what people are doing sometimes when they share misinformation or disinformation is they're not making a truth judgment about it at all. They're just saying, you, my social network, may find this entertaining like I did. So is that the thing we need to worry about? And is that the thing we need interventions about sharing? So the second set of thoughts related to this, what's the appropriate kind of level and timing of an intervention? And we've been talking about doing these kind of slow feed, low level reinforcement of kind of healthy skepticism. But is this just, in the end, is this just kind of scientific literacy? Is this a school subject in which we need to equip people at that stage in their education with an understanding of how science works, what the scientific method is, how to interpret scientific studies and their findings? And should we be devoting efforts to developing that kind of curriculum and pedagogies around that? And what do we do about everybody who's not, who's out of school? Can we reach people? Is it possible to do kind of scientific literacy training on people in older generations? Not sure. And then the third thing was, and I was just wondering about this myself, is, are people susceptible to false information in particular subject domains? So is it the case that some of us are super susceptible to anything that's got to do with kind of like high politics and spy networks, and we'll believe all that stuff? But then if you try to tell us that, there's this great new diet, we'll be sufficiently and healthily skeptical about the effectiveness of a diet or a beauty treatment. And so do we need to start differentiating between susceptibility to fake news in different subject domains and thinking about interventions which are tailored to those? So lots of questions, no answers, but looking forward to any thoughts on any of that.
I would definitely say, yes, we need to focus on the sharing of it as well, because like you say, this is all about being social with social media and it's participatory. So I've always sort of said, teaching people have a 7-second delay, because actually you don't realize by sharing it, you're now amplifying it and you're spreading it out there. And I did, when I was at the University of Hong Kong, I did some studies a while back now as part of my PhD, and I had just taught news literacy programs and did some surveys and research. And it was really interesting to note the attitude changes of the students, the university students, whereas before they said, oh, I wouldn't have cared about it, thought it was funny. Now it's like, oh, actually, I have a responsibility for my social network. And a lot of the times people are they'll share the information because they care about their family and they're trying to share being helpful, and not realizing that they're sharing the misinformation. And it's a part of their identity that they're actually trying to participate in their social community. So yes, just on that one alone, I could go on about some of the other things, but I'll share it around. But definitely something top of mind there with sharing.
Would Aaron or Chee like to comment as well, or before I do?
I had a very quick thought, Catherine and Olivia, on this issue about belief versus sharing. I agree with you, Olivia. I think it's important to disentangle that. And I don't know what the answer will be, but I would like to find out, what exactly the proportions are. I think some of this might link actually to the bit that Catherine shared about, the difference in age in terms of how people value information, on like more truth on the one hand versus new creative alternative perspectives, for your the younger groups that you had. I think that one is an interesting thing to consider there, because if those are indeed the most salient categories for some of the younger populations out there, then actually belief isn't part of it, right? For them, the value comes from the fact that there is pluralism of ideas and diversity, rather than on the veracity of individual sets of facts. And that, if you think about truth as providing kind of a base architecture for discussions to even take place, then we need to think about how we even define some of those common, common truth-related practices, or the common expectations that we have for the information that's out there. There was a great article in the Washington Post, I think a couple of weeks ago, by David Brooks, where he describes the two types of knowledge that groups or any community need to have to function well. One is what he calls kind of common myths, right? The underlying sets of assumptions and the emotional sources of resonance that people have in a space, right? So in the case of Singapore, it's the unification around this founding myth that we have. In the case of the US, it's the idea of from the many one, being the shining city on a hill, that provides at least broad aspects of unification, even though there's always reactions to them. And then a second kind of knowledge is what he called more propositional knowledge, right? And that's where the fake news stuff can actually start to affect people's perceptions of truth. The problem is, if you have too much chipping away and erosion of the propositional category of knowledge, then eventually the underlying social cohesion in that first mythic form of knowledge also gets eroded. And that causes problems for kind of the overall unification that countries or any society can have. And I suspect that's part of what's behind some of the culture wars that are out there. So if we take what Olivia just shared and kind of extrapolate it, I think this idea of what people even believe or choose to share as part of the overall set of common knowledge that they believe other people should be part of, that has actually quite large proportions when taken to its extreme. Thanks.
I just have a few small points. I think what complicates everything is that we are now living in what people have called a post-truth world, where the truth doesn't matter anymore, and people just have this innate disbelief about what are actually truths and facts. They look for shadows that are not there. Conspiracy theories abound. So I think that complicates a lot of efforts to try and tell people to be able to be more discerning. And I have to confess, I'm not very familiar with what our media literacy education encompasses, but I would think that what people need is a very basic framework or basic do's and don'ts. I think in general, and at risk of generalizing, Singaporeans tend to struggle with handling information that are conflicting, that are contradictory. They hear A and then comes along B, so they get disoriented. And how do I deal with this? Can A and B both be true at the same time? Or must it one be true and one must be falsehood? Some of them do see things in a very black and white environment, and the millennials, in fact, are moving away from that. So it's a transition period where the society is not very homogeneous, and that's where you see a lot of these disputes. And that also means our strategy or any campaign that we do can't be a one size fits all. So that again complicates what we try to do. So coming back to basic etiquette, I don't know if it will be helpful, and maybe this is really taught in the schools, but when you receive a piece of information, what do you do? Is there a checklist, includes whether you should share it or not? What are the basic stuff that you can do to ascertain the veracity and whether you pass it on or not? Yeah, those are just my thoughts.
Hi, Catherine.
Yes, go ahead.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, sure.
It was great listening to Anne, Aaron, and Chee. Maybe just a couple of things, right? If I can also contribute to the discussion based on the study that I have been doing. So Aaron talked about trust in government. I think potentially what is a problem is people's dependency or reliance on the government, right? So I mentioned phase 1 was conducted, we involved a survey conducted with 2,000 over Singapore residents. Phase 2 was a qualitative study done with a small subset of the same sample, where we conducted self-confrontational interviews. And, we really asked people why they did what they did when they look for information and when they verify information, etc. We also asked them about their perceptions and attitudes towards the problem of false information. And if we look at the phase 1 of the findings, which showed that more than 70% of the people would ignore the false information that they encounter on instant messaging apps, as well as social networking sites. And we kind of look at that in the context of the qualitative findings that we got from the interviews. Quite a significant number of people, especially those who were less informationally savvy, would ignore. And they gave reasons, they shared why they ignored the information. And there were a few reasons, right? Number one, they don't see false information as a big problem in Singapore. And they made direct comparisons with other countries, and they specifically named, for instance, the US, where they said that the politics and the media are a lot more polarized. They also said, some interestingly said they they did not take action because they felt that fake news was too big a problem and their singular action would not make a difference or make an impact. So hence, we're talking about apathy here. But we had quite a significant number of participants who told us, oh, you're not worried about the problem because the government will fix it. So in Singapore, the problems get stamped out very quickly because the government acts very quickly, right? So I think that's good, but that's also bad. Then with regards to media, a response to Chee Kiong, who raised the interesting question of the role of so-called alternative media, right? So if we look at the findings that we gathered from our study, the people who belong to the informationally savvy group consume higher levels of both news from legacy media and non-legacy media. right? So non-legacy media will include your alternative sites like the Online Citizen and Mothership. So what this suggests to us is that perhaps it is important, for people to have a diverse media diet to help strengthen their immunity towards false information. And in the qualitative part of the study, we also understood what mattered to people when they tried to evaluate or gauge the trustworthiness of a particular news source. And one of the key things was the appearance of neutrality, right? So they appreciated local mainstream media and drew comparisons between local mainstream media and foreign mainstream media because they said the media here was a lot more neutral. They appreciated media sources that provided two sides to a story. So that's important as well. So these are some of the key things and informational characteristics that we can further look into and see how we can kind of embed them in literacy programs. Just quick comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. I think your point about sharing is very interesting. And I think that there are experimental designs following a similar kind of concept as the one that we did, but then focusing mainly on sharing behavior to see whether people actually shared the news. But as you rightly point out, I think there's so many things going on in the mind of a person when they're sharing, right? So what is that data going to actually tell us that, like, after playing the game, they shared less than before? What does that actually tell us? Is it telling us that does that reflect true judgments about the stimuli, or is that reflecting maybe higher levels of apathy, or that they don't particularly care about this news that they're reading? So you're right. There's a lot of things going on about whether or not people share information. Would anybody else like to ask questions or raise comments? Christian, yes.
Yeah, I guess I fall back to my initial content. When I think about it, asking people if you think this article is true or false, if it's fake news or genuine news, this is for me like treating this task as an exam question. The problem is, in an exam question, you assume people studied it. People studied it, then you can ask it, is this a true or false statement? I can do this in an exam. This is the content. Then I can ask, is this true or false? These statements, 10 statements, tell me which is true or false. Because you made this example where you showed in some talk 2 articles and told them one of them is fake, one of them is genuine. People picked one and both were fake. This is not surprising at all. I mean, why would you know? Either I know the subject or don't. And if you tell me just one is true, I pick one. Just by looking at it, yeah, this sounds more different. If I don't know about it, if I haven't studied this topic, I have no idea if it's true or false. So so there is no surprise that people pick just one if you tell them there's just one. This also comes back to what Olivia said. There wouldn't be any kind of surprise if the susceptibility to fake news is depending on the subject. If I'm very familiar with exercise nutrition, I'm much more susceptible that I can see there is fake news compared to maybe politics that I'm not familiar with. I mean, this is to me completely obvious, because it all boils down to making fake news identification as a kind of exam question. To me, this explains everything and basically kind of makes these problems clear to me, that it's an arbitrary difficult problem for people to say, okay, this is fake news or not. Particularly if you have really, say, a well-motivated fake news spreader that don't use clickbait, they're really kind of neutral, professional sounding articles. If I don't know this topic, if it's about biomedicine and vaccines, like raises some blood measure value, I have no idea. I just can read it and say, yeah, it sounds good if it's not clickbaity. So the notion of objective truth is very, very difficult. So I'm not sure how to best how I would study it. Not as an exam question. I don't think this works really.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of points. The first is, yes, you're right. There's no objective truth, and this is why we, in the question, in the options that we gave to our participants, we didn't say, is this true or false? We said, do you think this is mostly true or mostly false? Because there's always some truth in fake news. And the thing is also, when people consume news, I mean, as I reiterate what I said before, you know, we are bombarded with information throughout the day on social media, and we sometimes consume news whether or not we want to, and sometimes we read things, as you said, it's true, we read a particular thing because we don't know anything about it, but we sometimes also read it because the headline sounds interesting, or it piques my interest. But what we're testing is not, what we're testing is to see whether participants are able to identify, you know, key signifiers, like the use of particular types of language, sensationalist language or polarizing language, as an indicator that the information that follows could potentially be fake news, be misinformation or disinformation.
Wouldn't it be then a good follow-up or control study to have particularly a topic that is not as mainstream, say some news about Japanese politics that people are not so familiar with? Can they still decide if it's true or false?
But I mean, that's the reason why we made the game about COVID-19, and we tested them on questions that are relevant to our local social political context.
Yeah, but
so you're right.
I'm just saying that to me the results are as expected, because it more like it reflects what the general sentiment is. It's not necessarily a statement about how the article looks like. It's more like how it compares with the general sentiment. It's a useful result. It's just, for me, a different result.
Okay.
Because to me, people, I don't really know that I can say, okay, this article is true or false. It's more like my current opinion is kind of molded by the general sentiment and compared with this. If it's very different compared with what my general sentiment is, then I'm much more likely to say, okay, this is fake news, which is a totally fine result. So it's a good result, but I wouldn't go so far that people can always identify good and fake news and genuine news based on this result. I think this is one more step that I'm not sure if I can make for myself. Again, just I'm always a bit skeptic, so sorry about that.
Also have one quick thing. It doesn't sort of address everything, but just also we work on a spectrum as well when we're looking at misinformation and disinformation. So it's not always necessarily that this is the result, we can have it straight away. Yes, no. There might be elements of the misinformation and disinformation that we're looking at that can have a kernel of truth in there, but then different contexts can be added, and it's a matter of whether or not people have the experience, I suppose, to just be aware that, oh, okay, there might be something more to this, because we can't always get the provenance straight away on something, and it can take time for things to come out. But what's quite worrying in the work that we do is we see a drip feed of just these little bits of misleading bits of information wrapped up in something else. And that's actually what we find quite problematic in a lot of the spaces that we look at. So I just think, yeah, I just want to sort of leave with that thought that there is a spectrum. It's not necessarily a binary yes, no. There's a lot of nuances as well in what we're looking at too.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I just lowered my hand. So.
Can I just add on to the conversation? Sorry, Almi here.
Yes, yeah, sure, Almi, go for it.
Sorry, I've been tuning in from 9 a.m., but right now I'm at the laundry, doing some laundry, and I just thought I would just share my work from home kind of situation here. Yeah, so I take on Christian's point, and I think it's a very good point raised on experimental procedures. I guess what we need to really look at is individuals' interaction with their own internal truth systems. And when they are exposed or to a stimulus, in this case, a fake news message, and in the conditions in which they are exposed to. And if you were to look at that, right, I feel there's a different climate of truth. Optimism. I think Aaron pointed to optimism, and this optimism is basically, I think, what our study has actually kind of shown, and I think Catherine actually shared it in one part, that how much one believes he or she is capable of telling the truth from misinformation. And I think these systems, as we all know right now, can be influenced by government, trust in government, that the government is able to, basically, if I were to just translate it down to individual actions, yeah, it's okay one. I can always I know where to get truth information, and this true information will come from .gov, for instance, when it comes to COVID-19. So I do not I don't think I'll be affected by any information, because at the end of the day, I know in my networks, I know there are sources that I'll be able to get the truth information. Therein lies the challenge, right? Like I think Carol also raised that dependency on over-reliant on government, which can challenge one's internal systems, back to the challenge when it imposed on experimental kind of manipulations, that, you know, it might pose a few challenge into really disentangling whether it's actually the game or the stimulus or the message itself, or it's inside one internal system that is influenced by this climate of truth provided by the government or the environment or the society that we live in. So I guess there is really no answer as yet. I don't think any one of us have a definite answer, and that's why we are all embarked in this research. And on so that's my thought that I can that I would like to share. On the study itself, in the spirit of pilot studies, so I think Catherine did an excellent job. We tried to get senior citizens more seniors into the study as participants. We experienced a little bit of difficulty because ultimately all studies are voluntary. So I think we would take all the useful feedback on board and expand on this study to have a bigger or a more comprehensive yet focused answer to some of the questions here. Yeah, just to add on. Now back to my laundry.
Thank you very much, Almi. Actually, I do want to come back to Christian's points, and I think you raised very valid points. That you know, we do make truth judgments, like, okay, what we were testing for in the fake news test was based on the assumption that that they kind of know about the topics that we were quizzing them about. But what you commented about, you know, the results are expected because of the familiarity, participants' familiarity with the topic, is actually not so true, in the sense that there have been other studies that tested people's ability to identify fake news on a topic that they were very familiar with, and they still did not perform well, precisely because of the use of deception techniques that I mentioned. So we wanted to see whether, you know, so we tested, yes, we had questions about COVID-19, but we also had other questions about other topics, but we really wanted to see whether participants were able to pick up on the deception techniques as red flags that would indicate that this is perhaps likely to be mostly false. The other thing about pre-existing beliefs as well, that people would answer the question as mostly true or mostly false, depending on their pre-existing beliefs, is also true. And this is very much, as a sociologist, this is exactly what we keep saying, that people consume information in a way that's filtered by their pre-existing beliefs, worldviews, and values. But then what do we do with that? I mean, as Aaron pointed out, it's very difficult to change people's beliefs. But so what we want to see is it possible to, okay, we don't change people's beliefs, but at least can we enable people to still identify red flags in information that they're consuming that could indicate that, you know, maybe this content is trying to convince me of a conspiracy theory, or is it maybe this post on social media is trying to emphasize polarization or make me more polarized in my view about this particular topic. So so this was kind of like the thinking behind the instruments. But I think you are right, we do need to be to question a little bit more about the assumptions behind the both the test questions as well as the game design itself, as Alex mentioned earlier. And there's a lot of room for improvement for sure. Okay, we have 4 minutes left. Does anybody would anybody like to make one more comment or question? No? Okay, well then, if not, I will end with my closing remarks, which is basically thank you very much, everybody, for making time for this workshop and for actively participating and for the questions. Really enjoyed our exchange, and also thank you very much for the suggestions for how to improve this experimental tool. And I hope we can continue with improving on this game and experimental design, even though we didn't find statistically significant results. But I'm sure there's still potential in this. And yeah, so have a nice rest of your afternoon. And thank you again. And I would maybe see some of you again on Friday for the sessions on public perceptions, or rather our participants' perceptions about COVID-19 vaccines. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Good luck with things.
Bye. Thank